All right, welcome back to Inclusive Design 24, brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, the Paciello Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies. Don't forget, you can subscribe to Inclusive Design 24 on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 and hitting the subscribe button. Don't forget to follow ID24Conf on Twitter, and if you have questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag, and we'll ask them at the end of the session.
Next up, we have Peter Grucza presenting Considering Accessible HTML Forms, JavaScript, and WAI-ARIA. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, guys. Hello, everybody. My name is Peter. I'm coming from Toronto here. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate the opportunity that's given to me. This topic's one of those things that I deal with on a daily basis at work. HTML forms, especially the mixture of JavaScript, ARIA. Where I work, there are thousands of forms that are paper-based and old school, just Java enterprise search engine type stuff, enterprise applications that are being transformed into a more modern looking and feeling and interactive paradigm, I guess is what you could call it. It's a big change, and we've been running into problems, and some of those problems may be problems that you're dealing with. But before I get deep into that, I just want to keep going here. I want to talk about forms. We've had forms in HTML officially for well over 21 years. This has been like watching a young person grow up, trying to graduate out of college. They're still not quite there yet. I remember actually developing, I won't date myself, but working on some of these things before specification for 3.2 was released. And things have improved, which is a good thing. So let's try and see how we can keep improving things. Right now, these days, we're dealing with a lot better technologies. We've got HTML5, we've got JavaScript, we've got WAI-ARIA that can all work together to help us. The big thing, and the most important thing to remember here, is that HTML5 is where the core of our work should focus. It gives us so much and so many capabilities across multiple platforms, across multiple devices, that we can minimize the use of all these other technologies so that users' experiences are consistent and usable and accessible to a wide group of people. And we can make sure that we focus on the inclusion of that group all the way through any application development or any forms development. Now, one of the things that's brought me to think about this talk was a survey that actually came out of WebAIM just at the end of 2017. There was two things that I think are important to consider. The second most problematic issue that people identified were screens or parts of screens that change unexpectedly. The sixth most difficult and problematic issue was complex or difficult forms. Now, if you think about what screens or parts of screens that change unexpectedly are, we're probably looking at JavaScript applications, maybe mobile, maybe some CSS, a few other things thrown in, but really screens or parts of screens that change unexpectedly are most likely being Ajax run, and even more so as days go by and years go by, we're seeing more and more single page apps, and they're forms based. And we're having problems actually satisfying the needs of our users and keeping things accessible for all users because of this. One of the things that's interesting about this survey is that it has increased over the years from being back at the, I think what was it here, the 7th most problematic thing in 2009, all the way up to the 2nd most in 2017. So obviously that's one area where things are getting worse. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about that today and how we can maybe start to think about and approach changes to what we have to do, or spread some understanding about what we need to do to make things a bit more accessible. But before I get into there, any form, okay, or any group of forms or any application, really, we need to start thinking about the structure of what we have to do and why we're building something and how we approach building it. Simplest thing that we can start to do is trying to map out a flow for the application through each of its states to identify each one of its issues. This is before we even start coding. We need to get an understanding of what we're trying to build. I've had the experience of having the project manager come to me, hand me a paper printed form that dated back 10 years and said, can you put this on the web? And at that point, the discussions begin as to how we actually change it to make it usable. When you have multi-page forms that users have to actually interact with, that deal with their taxes, that deal with payments, court services, that take care of insurance, or even childcare benefits, we need to be really careful and make sure that the actual flow and structure of what we're doing satisfies both the business, but especially the user, because no one's really coming to your site to actually fill out a form. They're there to have, they've got a goal, and they would like to actually interact with you. So the more things that we put in their way, the more frustration that we raise. And the more frustration that we raise, the more complaints that we get. So one of the issues that I've found over time is that there's two different models that people take when trying to build these forms. One of them has to do with focusing on the implementation. I call this more of a database-driven forms approach. What you'll find is the inputs match up exactly with the fields that are in the database, okay, that was developed some time ago, okay, under a different paradigm. This causes our users to actually enter more data than what they need to. It causes more possibilities of errors, and more time and concentration focus is actually lost as they have to struggle through the form again and again. Okay? The other paradigm is more of a user goals-based approach, which means we can simplify things and break things down to make it a little bit easier on a cognitive level for everyone interacting with the form, not just people with disabilities, but anybody. As soon as we can actually break things up and chunk things up into items that a person knows about themselves as opposed to the items that a business wants, we can actually make the process a bit easier and help the user step through all of our actual requirements. Chunking of the information is going to be really important as we go forward. Screens are no longer being fully reloaded. We're having partial screens reloaded. This is causing a whole series of issues for users as they actually start to trying to figure out what is going on, because the paradigm that we're talking about going into more single page app applications is throwing us all for a loop. One of the things, once we start to break down the information, is we can get a little bit finer and start to look at what we have to do on an individual page or screen basis, as opposed to one large screen. The approach that I'm proposing is more to do with providing smaller chunks and a smaller load for individuals to manage when they're dealing with things. It fits easier, and we can break things out so that we can have a more of a, here's your personal information, and you probably know what that is, and Then we can break it down even farther to say on a separate screen, here's more of the detailed information that you may need for us as a business to actually satisfy your needs. When we start to look at that, we can also start to plan out how the form works. Okay? We can figure out where focus will go on load, especially if the page is not reloading anymore. That's the new thing that we have to start really paying attention to. And it's actually an old issue because we still have to manage where the actual user flow is, and that's the tab order. Okay, the focus order within any form is still an important thing, and how we construct that. And then we can start to define the different interactions of what will happen within each one of the actual steps that a user takes before we actually start to build anything. And once we know how to actually put things together before we build, I'm going to start to be able to identify where some of the actual pressure points are so that we don't have to get stuck too much. So one of the things to actually start defining at the very early stages is that focus order, what are all the actions that a keyboard user will have to do, ensure that the keyboard focus is indicated visually throughout all of this. We can also make sure that within our mock-ups, we can start including some of the copy that we're going to use to make sure that the actual language is clear and precise for our users, that they can read it easily, and that it's in a language that they can understand, as opposed to being the business language that we may rely on every single day within our work life. And no one outside of our office really knows what we're talking about. If you've ever seen Yes Minister and the language that's used by the public servants there, well, it's true. The thing that we have to also focus on is how we're actually going to start dealing with the different platforms and devices that our audience has. If we're dealing with a full public, then we've got a much different situation than if we're actually building something for a very specific client that may be doing something on a single platform. These are all considerations that we can deal with at the very beginning and structure side of things before we start coding. As we go into the structure, as opposed to that high level, can actually start defining what is important within the individual pages. Because this is where we can start to identify if we have different views of our content that are changing and loading, we have different sections of a form, if we need different areas to work with, define it early so that we can actually make sure that our users can navigate, because people can actually navigate through landmarks onto different portions of the page. Okay, traditionally, and we still do this, and we should still keep doing this, is to find the heading structures that map up to those actual landmarks. So people have multiple ways to navigate and move through the page. A lot of times that we're still saying that people aren't doing this. This is an old problem, and it's still a problem. Now, the next area that I'm going to look at are labels. This may seem like one of the simplest things that people may know. People may not know it, and people don't know it, because we still see a lot of divs, a lot of spans, wrapping other interactive elements and hoping that they actually provide a name or do something. The first thing that I see all the time actually is just putting some text next to an actual input. That may give us a visual indication of what may be required, but there's no real actual association between that visual text and what an individual input item is. Users, not all users will be able to use that in an accessible way. Even when we start adding a label around that same piece of text, just because the text and label are right next to an input element doesn't help us. Now, when we start to actually get serious about this, we can actually create an association, a real association between the label and the actual input. This association is something that can be used by a number of different people. Somebody using a mouse can click on the label now. That'll actually be entered into the actual input field. People with screen readers will be able to actually identify what the name of the actual field is. It gives us a much broader breadth of where people can click and where people can interact with. All the way around, it starts to become much more of a usable, accessible input. Now, it's also important that we consider different ways that, let's say, a person using a screen reader would interact with a form. Okay? If we don't actually associate the name with the input, we're going to be leaving people out. Okay? Some people may actually focus on each individual item within the form rather than just reading through everything that's on the screen. And if we don't have this association, there'll be no name announced. Actually, what will be announced in most instances is text input. Whether or not it's required or not may be there, but really it's just text input, and that's all. Now, there's a few more things that we can do with this. The way we can actually wrap, if you feel like you don't want to create an explicit association, you can still wrap a label around a piece of text, around a text input, I'm sorry, or any other widget input, really. This still creates a proper label. It creates an accessible name. Both processes create an accessible name. We'll get to that in a little bit. It's known as an implicit association of these of this relationship. So that sort of relationship is often used with radio and checkbox inputs so that we can group things in different ways. The one way is to actually have a yes or no against a radio input on the right-hand side. That's a convention within our culture, okay? And also just because it helps layout to a large degree. So it's still working to create a real relationship. Now, if we wanted to actually create an explicit relationship, we can even add a for to the actual ID of the element, because that's what we need to do, is create a for to ID from the label to an input, and that gives it a proper name. It's the simplest way to do it. Buttons are even simpler until we make them difficult. Anything that's inside the button can be used as its label, and it's also going to be presented as its accessible name. Sometimes we may want to hide things from users, and we may want to have a background or some other graphic on top of a button. That's what's showing on the screen right now, just a small little button of a camera. It's actually got a photo credit that it can open. You can hide that text, okay, and still make it available to all users. Hide the text through a method that is available to screen readers, okay? You may have heard of visually hidden or an SR-only CSS classes. It was basically just take things and put them off to the side, okay? They're still available in the accessibility tree, and they can still be reused, okay, by people using different assistive technologies. Now, we can get a bit more complicated when we start looking at ARIA again. It provides a few different ways for us to create an accessible name. And within that, we start having to consider a hierarchy of how we're going to build these things. Because even if you had content on the screen, there is that same button, and there's an attribute that's assigned to that button called ARIA label equals photo credit. If we had content within the actual button, then people using a screen reader, people using different assistive technologies, could actually find that what was the text within the button would be different from what the ARIA label says. And the ARIA label will take precedence. We can even go farther with this in that we can actually reuse content from elsewhere within the document that we're serving. So that using an ARIA labeled by, referencing to an external ID on a different element, we'll be able to actually pull the name from that external element and reuse that. We can actually use this in multiple different ways. Okay? And we can actually combine multiple IDs in a space-separated list, create a longer and possibly more meaningful name. There is a technique that we can use actually that circles back onto itself so that if the button had an ID and we wanted to include an ID text from another element, we could actually combine the two into one to have a longer name. I'm not going to try and get into that right now, but it is a way to actually expand and gives us a lot of different capabilities. Now, this becomes important because we really want to make sure that everything that we're actually serving to our users has an appropriate name, role, and value. There's a calculation formula actually for how that name is put together. Simplest way to think about it is that the ARIA labeled by is going to take precedence over the ARIA label, which will take precedence over an actual label, which will take precedence over a title. And I mentioned title there because it is still being used after all these years in many different ways for many different purposes. It provides us with a lot of heartache, at least where I work, because some of the older systems like to use label everywhere for everything, except that they would use some automated text to go into there. What will happen is sometimes that title will become the accessible name for something and it will become gibberish to a user. The other possibility is if, and this is a warning, that if a title is used but one of the other attributes is, or the label is assigned and a label and a proper name is assigned, title is going to become part of the description, which ends up becoming much more confusing for users because you have things repeated multiple times, or sometimes you have, like I mentioned, gibberish just being launched out. Now I want to take a very brief side note. One of the things that's part of forms, it's been around for a number of years, known as field set. Okay. Field set is a way to group controls. Think of groups of, think of a yes and a no radio button. Okay. We want them to be grouped underneath a single question, but we want to have one say yes and one say no, and somebody has to pick one or the other. Well, the field set allows you to group those. And if it's done properly, by combining field set with a legend, the actual first legend element of the field set, that's a child, it's going to become the field set's name. So you end up having a grouping element for people that they can navigate to. Problem is, recent study coming out of Boku, making changes, they're hoping to make changes to how this is implemented. Recent study actually found that the field set elements being used they did this survey of some of the top pages on the internet, found that field set elements being used in 8.41% of those pages, but the legend element is only being used in 2.46. That means is that field set doesn't have a name. So if you were trying to associate a yes/no radio button just inside a field set without actually giving it a proper legend element, the question that you were hoping would be read on against each one of those fields would not actually be read. Next up, I want to start taking a slight detour into single page apps. Okay. So what is a single page application? It's basically an application or website for users to interact with, dynamic. The single current page is actually going to be rewritten in different ways rather than using an older model, okay, where we used to load an entire page from a server. The individual pieces and components are being pushed into the application for users to interact with. The older model, the traditional model, is the server provides a page. Okay. Screen reader user gets focus on that page. It's fairly simple because it's loaded accurately. Here's the page. The next thing that'll happen is the title can be announced, and then a user can move into the content. It's how we've traditionally done things since way back when HTML 3.2 was still in play. These days, single page app is going to be relying on a dynamic content view. It means that some sort of call or some sort of hidden content within the actual forms is changing right underneath the user. So this is the major change to the traditional model. Interaction, focus, all of the changes that are happening have to be managed in a completely different model from what everyone's been used to. People are using frameworks to do this right now, React, Angular, others. This is really a shift, not necessarily for the development community, because development community is always trying new things, but for interaction designers and also for the users to manage how we actually deal with the minor focus changes, the actual smaller content changes or large-scale content changes. It's a new avenue that really needs to be managed. What we need to be able to do is focus on the needs of the users that are actually interacting with the page. When we change that interaction model, it's really up to us to provide that usable and accessible experience that we've taken away by taking away that older model. Focus needs to be moved throughout the app. Okay? Visual changes of content, they need to be announced in different ways. Okay? We need to be able to identify new states of the application. Okay? So I'd like to start talking a little bit about managing focus. One of the big things that we need to be able to do as we go through this and as the views change, okay, is to be careful that we are helping the user move to where they need to go. What I mean by that is sometimes things will be deleted from out from under them and focus is lost completely from the page. Now, what is focus management really? Everyone that relies on a keyboard, that would be not just screen reader users. Not everyone that's using a screen reader, okay, uses a keyboard, and not everyone that uses a keyboard is a screen reader user. We need to be able to be explicit in how we manage the focus and the interaction that keyboard users have to deal with. We need to be able to make sure that they can move through the app without getting lost, without losing focus, meaning being thrown out of the actual page. As we go forward, one of the best things that we can still do is rely on HTML elements, links, buttons, form elements. Those are our foundational elements. Those are a foundation of our work. Okay? They each receive focus properly, and they can actually provide standard for interactivity and accessibility for our users. The first thing that I'm trying to ensure that we do with development in this area is focus on developing a plan for the actual keyboard users. So the overall focus management, the key when changing the structure of the page. If users don't rely on assistive technology, they'll still rely on visual indications of where the focus is going to, where they can interact with, and also where any sort of action can occur. It's easy for users to get lost. Okay? When you're creating a new view, you have to ask yourself, what's happening? What is the user's experience when they're relying on maybe a piece of content or a widget that was actually in that view? When a user performs an action to make a change, where do they go? Are they expecting to go there? All of these things can be put forward inside of a focus management plan. If you've ever left a site or an app just because you're becoming confused with it, or because you simply couldn't use it, that's what's happening to our users. Are we moving to actual elements that can be focused? And are we actually providing the proper indications? So what we can do for some of this underlying work is treat it the way that we have in the past. We have CSS that can actually hide things from users and take elements out of the actual focusable tree. The display none can be applied to areas where users shouldn't be able to tab into. We can actually do a little bit more work on our end as developers and as designers, okay, by considering where we need to hide things from a screen reader user, or what focusable elements need to be hidden, and combine the ARIA hidden equals true and the tab index equals -1, so that people don't actually get into areas of the actual documents before they're usable or after they're not usable. The actual other thing that we can do is very simple, is to try to determine where the user is as they're working before we make a change. The document has active element, and we can try to make sure that before we force a change on a user, we know where they are. Now, part of what we have to deal with in all of this is working with the tab index. Also, technology has been with us for a long time. Okay? If we need to actually move users to non-interactive areas and non-focusable elements, then in the same way that we set up the structure for their documents at the very beginning by defining landmarks, we can set a tab index -1 on one of those landmarks and move the focus to it. At least the user will have a chance to understand where they are within the document. Tab index -0, we may need to use that, and probably will need to use that, on any custom-built controls. I've had people ask about tab index greater than 0, and there's really no reason to use it. It's actually going to change the flow of the document, and it's going to introduce user issues as they try to move through and get taken away from where they expect to be going. Now, one of the things that we can actually do at this point before developing is refer to the WAI authoring practices as part of our plan for what we're going to deal with our keyboard users. Because right within there is a huge section of information defining how keyboard interfaces should work and how we have to develop them as JavaScript developers, but also an understanding of where focus goes in there so we can actually highlight things properly. And that comes back down to our design folks. Once we've sort of figured out how we're going to start to manage the focus, we're going to try to have to look at ARIA live regions. Possibly because this will give us an opportunity to announce changes that are happening in the background that the user may not be expecting or that are important to convey so that updates to content that may be happening, okay, are usable. It's part of a combined effort between focus management and live regions to make the experience an enjoyable one as opposed to a frustrating one. Essentially, if we can keep our interactions sparse, if we can keep our announcements sparse for the users and keep still providing them with a usable experience, we'll have a chance to effectively help them. Now, the next thing as part of this is planning on actually how we're going to give the users an update. Mention that one of the recommended approaches is to use ARIA live regions. Okay, they can actually a live region can update a screen reader when content is changing and when they're not there and there's no focus for them. So a different part of the page changes, they can get an update. As I mentioned, being sparse with how we use these things is usually best. You wouldn't want somebody just rattling on in your ear continuously, repeating messages. The thing that'll happen is screen reader may stop and won't repeating messages. So if you say the same thing multiple times, okay, because something's loading again and again and again, it's likely that it's just not going to make its way through to the user. It's important to remember that live regions will need to be in place before we actually try and add any content to them. So basically, it's part of your structure of your original document that's getting served. Once we actually start deciding that this is an approach to take, the next thing to deal with is deciding which sort of flavors of live regions we're going to deal with. Because there's multiple different combinations. Usually what I'm recommending to the folks that I work with, that we only deal with two, okay? One would be the alert, and that's for serious, important issues. They're usually time-sensitive messages. Could be for errors, could be for a timeout. They're critical. They may make a system announcement to the actual user to let them know that something really needs attention at this point. It'll interrupt the flow of what the user is doing and really should be used rarely. Now, the next one will be coming from a role of status. Status provides more of an advisory messages. It waits for an opportunity to actually update the user. It won't interrupt them right away. So again, be wary of working with the alerts because they are aggressive and they're really anti-usability if you overpower the user with them. Content of the live regions is usually going to be empty and not focusable. It's not something that always needs to be on the page. Okay? Remember, these are more items that can be briefly updated and then removed so that new content can be added. The example is on the screen of how this might work. It's just a quick example, so don't blame me if it doesn't work if you try to re-implement it on your side. So the first thing that we do is we want to actually load a live region, okay, onto the page. The code is right in front of you. You'll notice that it's simply a div, an empty div. Okay, and I've assigned the role equal status to it. Then the text after that's been loaded can be pushed into that particular area, okay? And that will be spoken by the screen reader to its users. Afterwards, maybe about 3.5 seconds later, we can remove it, okay? So we clear out that area. It's still going to be spoken even if it hasn't made its way through to the user. It's in a queue. These messages are all queued up, okay, and managed through the technologies. So that was a long side road. I'm going to come back to forms now, because it's all about managing forms in different ways. We have no one way to actually manage how we're going to prevent and handle errors of our users. We can start with prevention. That's the best thing that we can do. I guess the first thing that we should try and work with is providing instructions at the beginning of any session, okay, in any form. They let users gather the required information that they need, so that if they have to actually go off and get information from a different source, maybe an envelope which has their social security number or something, okay, in it, let them know that they need this in advance. Okay? Notify users also if you're trying to use a timeout, if there's some sort of security issue that you have just after a certain amount of time, notify people. Also, we need to really focus on keeping text short and clear. When we look at that, can be at the top of almost every form. It's just a short, brief introduction of what the form is actually there to do and what the user needs to be prepared for. When we get down to a field level, we need to definitely identify which fields are required. Format is required, okay? Then we need to be able to provide them instructions. Okay? The worst thing that can happen all the time, and everyone has problems with this, how are we going to enter dates in the US, in Canada, in Europe? They're all different. One of the things that is on the screen right now is just a very simple example, okay, of how we can lay out just this very simple login form with a few notes identifying which items are going to be required for our users, and also with that, if they need special information to be able to gather right before we start using a form. The code actually is very simple. It's at the bottom of the screen. You'll notice that I've wrapped any individual messages for an individual field inside the label, so it's read out as soon as the user gets onto the input. Users also need to be made aware of errors. This is correct. Identify for them how they can actually fix things to move forward. You need to be able to find where the errors are within a page, and errors should not be too much of a nuisance. Okay, if you've ever tried to fill in a form field and had it give you an error as soon as you start typing, or after you've hit one key, you'll know what I'm talking about nuisances. Error messages should also be available right up until somebody tries to resubmit. If you look at the HTML5 error handling in different browsers, when you add validate, or when you don't have no validate on your form, you notice that not only do they have different ways of handling this, but the error messages disappear. So I can't remember what it was I was supposed to correct. Now, one of the ways that we can deal with the error correction side of things is to put an actual box at the top of our form or somewhere within our page that will actually notify the user of what all the individual errors are and provide links down to the individual form fields where there are problems. Setting focus to this region and then providing those links so that they can move forward is one way to help them get to where they need to be. The next thing that we can do for users is make sure that the individual form fields have the errors associated with them. We can use ARIA described by for the individual inputs referencing an error. Okay. We can also assign, and we should assign, the ARIA invalid equals true to an input. Basically, the ARIA described by will reference another element's ID and read out the content of that. The ARIA invalid will identify whether or not something is good or bad and needs to be managed for when errors are corrected. That's it for me, guys. I'm at 45 minutes, I believe. And I don't know if I have time to do what I really wanted to be able to do and start going with you through form. We're at 40.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we can try to do this real quick.
Sure.
Go for it.
Okay. So, good day once again. This is just a sample form that's showing a number of different areas that I've talked about, some good, some bad. You'll notice if you're watching on the screen that there's a little green button at the bottom that says login. As I'm typing here, what I'm going to do is, you'll notice that there's very little indication of focus, although I do have a cursor there. The green button, if you were to actually check, it would actually meet a contrast ratio. That is great, but it doesn't have focus indicator on it. And I'm thrown back because I'm having to use the HTML5 errors. I'm going to go back. I'm going to try to get with my keyboard back down to the login button. There we go. And here I am. I'm on the very first page. You may not be aware of this, but I have lost complete focus, okay, on the actual document. Why is that? Because the managing of the focus has completely been gone. So it's thrown out of the form. One of the common errors that people do, they don't actually understand where the person's supposed to go. So I'm just going to fill in a little bit of information here really quick. Is what you'll notice. There's a number of different changes. This is a button element. Sorry, this is just an integer element. So now I start getting a little bit of focus happening on the buttons. I've changed the color of that button, the green button on the next, because if I was having a colorblind issue, green is not a very good situation for me to be in. Blue is actually going to give you a bit more affordance to understand what's going on. This time, focus was actually moved right to the top of the form. The voiceover system that I use announces it properly, and I move directly into the first form field when I'm moving through, but the actual content of the beginning of the form is announced. Notice I've changed the actual required, of how required is supposed to be put in here to be a bit more explicit rather than using an asterisk. A lot of little things that we can do, okay, to try and make things more explicit for our users in how they actually work with us. Each one of these fields is using each one of the fields is being set up in a different way, and they're using an autocomplete, okay, which I've customized to actually meet the needs of the individual user. That was on the individual personalization pages, where I was entering our personal content. Okay. Now I'm on the service preferences page. The autocompletes are no longer here. And there we go, right at the end. If I was doing a financial transaction or legal transaction, okay, I'd want to be able to allow the user to confirm all the information that they were doing. One of the big things that I was trying to make a point of there is that it's easy for people to get lost when they select something and items won't be announced to them. The actual focus, it's important to keep people focused within the forms as they're filling out that form. Okay? Otherwise, it's a loss.
Well, thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
So that's all the time we got for right now.
Yep.
If you liked Peter's talk, hit the like button on YouTube. Remember, you can check out all ID24 talks at youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 and subscribe for future notifications. And as a reminder, Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, the Paciella Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies, with thanks to our sponsor, DQ Systems. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with Marcos Caceres, who will be talking about how web payments will make paying for things more accessible on the web. Thank you.